The evening started as an innocent gathering among friends. We were college students back for winter break, reunited in our small, sleepy hometown with nothing much to do but talk, catch up, and reminisce. It was at Amy's house, one of those old, historic homes with creaky floors and too many empty rooms. The house had a charm, an antique sort of feel, but on a cold December night, it felt unsettling. Amy had an idea. Let's do something thrilling. Something we'll remember, she said with a mischievous glint in her eye. That's when she pulled out the Ouija board. I'd seen it sitting in her family's attic years before, forgotten and covered in dust. It was one of those boards made from real wood, with intricate carvings and an age that gave it a sinister aura. I could have sworn it smelled faintly of incense and something else I couldn't quite place. Most of us hesitated. I mean, who wouldn't? We'd all heard stories of people messing with Ouija boards and inviting something dark into their lives, but Amy was persistent, brushing off our concerns with a laugh. It's just a game, she insisted, her fingers already brushing the edge of the board. Come on, don't be such cowards. In the end, peer pressure won. We sat in a circle on her cold wooden floor, our knees touching, the candles casting flickering shadows on our faces. There was me, Amy, her boyfriend Derek, and two others, Sam and Liz. We each placed our fingers on the planchette, its polished surface chilling against our skin. Amy took charge, her voice low and theatrical. Is anyone there? She asked, her eyes flicking around the room with an excitement that made me nervous. The planchette didn't move at first. We waited in silence, our breaths barely audible, watching each other with guarded expressions. Just when I thought nothing would happen, the planchette shifted slightly under our fingers. At first, I thought it was Amy pushing it, but her eyes widened in genuine surprise. Derek laughed nervously, but none of us let go. Who are you? Amy asked, her voice trembling now. The planchette slid across the board, the letters barely visible in the dim candlelight. EVL, and it spelled. My stomach churned. Evan was the name of Amy's little brother who had drowned in the lake behind their house years ago, a tragedy that had left her family broken. She hadn't mentioned him in years, her face turned ashen, her mouth opening and closing as if she wanted to say something but couldn't. Are you? Are you my Evan? Amy whispered, tears pooling in her eyes. There was a beat of silence before the planchette slowly moved to Y. Yes, the air in the room grew heavier, almost suffocating. The candles flickered, their flames sputtering as though disturbed by an unseen force. Amy was shaking now, and I reached out, ready to pull her away from the board, but she shook her head, determined to keep going. Why did you leave? She choked out, her voice barely a whisper. The planchette moved faster this time, gliding over the board with a force that felt unnatural. D-R-R-K it spelled, and O-C-H-O-I. C-E Liz, who had been silent, leaned back, visibly disturbed. This isn't funny, Amy. I don't like this. Not one bit. But Amy wasn't listening. She was fixated on the board, her fingers gripping the planchette as if it were her only lifeline. What do you want? She asked, almost pleading. F-R-E-E was the answer. The room temperature dropped noticeably, a chill sweeping over us as though a window had been flung open. I could see my breath misting in front of me, the candles flickering more wildly, casting strange, twisting shadows that seemed to dance and shift in the corners of the room. Amy swallowed hard, tears streaming down her cheeks. How can I free you, Evan? The answer came slowly, the planchette moving with a sinister deliberation. J-O-I, and it spelled. My heart dropped. We all pulled our hands back, panic flaring up in our chests. But Amy kept her fingers on the planchette, ignoring our horrified expressions. She was in a trance, her eyes fixed on the board with a look of desperate longing that chilled me to the bone. "Amy, please let's stop," I begged, grabbing her shoulder, but she shrugged me off, her hand shaking as she continued. "I'll do it, Evan. I'll join you. Just tell me what to do." Her voice was soft, detached, as though she were in some kind of daze. At that moment, every candle blew out, plunging us into complete darkness. A freezing draft swept through the room, carrying a sickly sweet scent that made me gag. It was then I realized what the smell was: decaying flowers. In the pitch-black silence, Amy screamed, a high, piercing sound that echoed through the empty house. We fumbled to relight the candles, and when the flames finally flickered back to life, she was gone. Just gone. The chair she'd been sitting in lay toppled over, the Ouija board resting in the center of the circle with the planchette pointing at the word goodbye. Derek and I searched the house, calling her name, checking every room, every closet, every corner. But there was no sign of Amy. Liz and Sam stayed in the room, huddled together, their faces pale and terror-stricken. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, it was as though Amy had vanished into thin air. To this day, we never found her. Some say she joined her brother in the afterlife, lost to whatever dark forces we had foolishly disturbed. I think about that night often, the shadowy shapes that seemed to dance around us, the finality of that last word on the board. But sometimes, late at night, I'll hear a faint whisper, a voice that sounds just like Amy, calling my name. And I wonder if she's really gone, or if she's still here, waiting for someone to join her. After moving into my college apartment, I never imagined anything unusual about my new neighbors. Sure, the building was old, with hallways that creaked underfoot and doors that never quite shut right. But it was cheap, and the location was ideal. My roommate, Eli, was a quiet guy, always engrossed in his studies, so we made a good match. It was the perfect setup for a calm school year, or so I thought. Our apartment was on the second floor, and directly across the hall lived a guy named Victor. He was tall, thin, and always wore the same faded brown coat, no matter the weather. He hardly ever spoke, only giving slight nods in greeting whenever we crossed paths. I didn't think much of him. He was just another quiet person living his life. But then strange things started happening. It began with noises at night. I'd lie in bed, drifting off to sleep, only to be jolted awake by what sounded like soft tapping on the walls. Sometimes, the noise was accompanied by a faint scratching sound that seemed to come from just above my bed. Eli and I joked about it being rats, but there was a tension in his voice I couldn't ignore. One night, after a particularly loud scratching, I decided to confront Victor. I knocked on his door, trying to keep calm, and waited. A long minute passed before he opened it, his face shadowed by his ever-present coat collar. "Hey, man, do you hear those weird sounds at night?" I asked, half expecting him to brush me off. Instead, his expression shifted slightly, almost like he knew exactly what I was talking about. "It's nothing, just don't listen to it," he muttered, before closing the door in my face. The interaction left me unsettled, but I decided to take his advice. Maybe it was just the building settling, or some nocturnal animal finding its way inside. A week later, Eli and I returned from a late-night study session, laughing and talking as we entered our apartment. The hallway was empty, dimly lit by the flickering overhead light. Just as I unlocked our door, I caught a glimpse of Victor's door. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness behind it. "Eli, look," I whispered, nodding toward Victor's door. We exchanged uneasy glances, curiosity getting the better of us. I moved closer, peering through the small gap. Victor's apartment was pitch black, but as my eyes adjusted, I noticed a faint shadow moving inside, slow and deliberate. For a second, I thought I saw Victor standing in the middle of his living room, just staring at the wall. I couldn't make out his face, but something felt wrong, as though he was aware we were watching him. I turned back to Eli, but when I looked again, Victor's door was closed. My heart raced, convinced I had seen something that I wasn't meant to. A few nights later, I was awoken by the same scratching sound, only this time it was louder. Desperate for sleep, I banged on the wall, hoping it would stop. Instead, it grew more frantic, as if someone were clawing at the walls with nails. Eli ran into my room, pale-faced, and we both listened in silence. The scratching sound moved, traveling from my room toward the living room, then back again. We decided to call the landlord, and the following day, a maintenance guy came by to check the walls for pests. He knocked around, inspected corners, and shrugged, saying everything seemed normal. But when he went into the hallway, his face paled. Victor's door was covered in scratch marks. The faded wood bore deep grooves, and some parts had splintered as if someone, or something, had desperately tried to break through. When Eli and I pointed it out to him, the maintenance guy shook his head, mumbling, "No one ever comes in or out of that apartment, you know. I've been working here 3 years, and I swear I've never seen that man leave." Later that night, I decided to stay up and keep watch on Victor's door, curiosity mingling with fear. I kept my lights off, peering through the peephole every few minutes. Just as the clock struck 3 a.m., his door slowly creaked open, heart pounding. I strained to see inside. There was nothing, just darkness. A shuffling sound echoed from within, and I could see a faint outline moving slowly toward the hallway. I held my breath, backing away from my door. My heart thudded as I watched the shadow pass by, pausing right in front of our door. It lingered, almost as if listening, before moving on and vanishing down the hall. The following day, I found Eli packing his bags. He didn't explain much, just kept repeating that he couldn't sleep here another night. After he left, I thought about doing the same, but something kept me there, a morbid fascination, perhaps, or maybe a lingering sense that I couldn't leave without answers. On my last night in the apartment, I decided to check Victor's door one last time. It was unlocked, as though inviting me in. I pushed it open and entered the dark, silent room. The smell of dampness filled my nostrils, and the air felt thick, suffocating. In the faint light from the hallway, I saw the walls lined with strange symbols carved into the wood, each one more grotesque than the last. And then, in the corner of the room, I found it, a makeshift altar with old, faded photos, candles, and bits of bone carefully arranged in a grotesque pattern. At the center of it all was a photograph of a person who looked just like Victor, but the date on the back read 1935. I stumbled out, unable to comprehend what I had seen. As I locked the door behind me, I heard a familiar scratching sound coming from inside the apartment. A soft, agonizing scratching that grew louder as I backed away. I left that apartment the next morning, my bags hastily packed and my heart racing. I never saw Victor again, and I never returned to that building. But every now and then, I think back to those nights, to the man who never seemed to leave, and the shadow that seemed to watch us from the darkness. Sometimes, in the dead of night, when everything is still, I hear that scratching sound in my dreams, relentless and desperate, as if it's calling me back to that haunted apartment across the hall. When I signed the lease for my new basement apartment, I thought I'd struck gold. It was more spacious than any place I'd seen in my price range, and the privacy it offered was unbeatable. The landlord, Mr. Thatcher, was a peculiar old man who made a point of mentioning how quiet the other tenants were. It didn't take long for me to discover he wasn't exaggerating. The apartment above mine stayed silent at all hours, and I rarely saw anyone coming or going. It was eerie, sure, but I told myself it was a good thing. I needed the peace. The basement apartment was perfect, aside from one strange detail, an old, battered door in the back of the kitchen that didn't appear to lead anywhere. The first time I noticed it, I assumed it was a former exit now sealed shut. I tried to open it once, just out of curiosity, but the handle wouldn't budge. It's probably just storage, I told myself, convincing myself not to think any further about it. Weeks passed without incident. I settled in, adjusting to the occasional creaks from upstairs and the strange silence from my neighbors. Then, one rainy night, I started hearing the sounds. It was around midnight when the first knock came, a soft but deliberate sound, coming from somewhere deep within the walls. I froze, holding my breath, straining to listen. It was so faint, I almost thought I was imagining it. But then it came again, 3 soft, rhythmic taps, echoing through the stillness of my apartment. My gaze darted to the sealed door in the kitchen. I walked over, feeling silly, but unable to shake my curiosity. I pressed my ear to the door, and that's when I heard the whispering. A soft, almost inaudible voice, too muffled to understand. I yanked my head back, my pulse racing, trying to tell myself it was nothing more than my mind playing tricks. But the whispering continued, relentless and unsettling. The next day, I asked Mr. Thatcher about the door. He gave me a long, knowing look before replying, "Nothing behind that door, dear, old pipes. Sometimes they groan in the cold." He laughed, but it was forced, and his eyes didn't meet mine. But as the days went by, the noises grew more intense. At night, I would hear scraping sounds, like something scratching the other side of the door, accompanied by faint, desperate whispering. I barely slept, every creak and groan putting me on edge. I told myself it was just an old building settling, the sounds amplified by my paranoia. One night, I decided to record the sounds. Armed with my phone, I waited by the door, hoping to catch something on tape to prove I wasn't imagining things. The whispering started right on schedule, soft and chilling. My hands shook as I held up my phone, recording the low, guttural sounds. When the noises stopped, I hit playback, hoping to make sense of it. What I heard sent a chill down my spine. The whispering was clearer in the recording, the words distorted but unmistakable. "Let me in. Please, let me in." I dropped the phone, staring at the door in horror. My brain scrambled to rationalize it, but there was no denying what I had just heard. The pleading voice sounded desperate, as if someone, or something, was trapped on the other side. The next day, I went to the landlord, demanding an explanation. Mr. Thatcher looked at me with a weary expression, his face pale. "You shouldn't have tried to listen," he whispered, almost to himself. "What's behind that door?" I pressed, my voice shaking. He took a deep breath, glancing around as if to make sure no one else could hear. "That door leads to the old foundations. A long time ago, something happened down there. A tenant got stuck." "Stuck," I echoed, not understanding. Mr. Thatcher's face twisted in discomfort. "Some say he's still there, lost in the walls. We tried sealing the door, but—" He trailed off, and I felt a sickening realization settle over me. He knew. He had known all along about the noises, the whispers, the scratching. That night, I stayed in bed, determined to ignore the sounds, but as the clock struck midnight, the knocking started, louder and more insistent than ever. This time, it wasn't coming from the kitchen door. It was right outside my bedroom. I lay frozen, staring at the closed door, my heart pounding. The knocking turned to banging, the sound relentless and furious. The whispering grew louder, as though it were inside my room, surrounding me. "Let me in, let me in." The voice was right next to my ear, cold and pleading. I covered my ears, squeezing my eyes shut, praying for it to stop, but it didn't. The banging intensified, shaking the walls, as if something was trying to break through. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The silence was deafening, and I lay there, trembling, afraid to move. In the morning, I found deep scratches on the inside of my bedroom door, long grooves that hadn't been there the night before. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whatever was behind that door, it wasn't confined to the kitchen. It could move, it could find me, no matter where I went. The next day, I moved out without a second thought. I didn't care about the lease or the money I had already paid. I needed to be as far away from that apartment as possible. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear it, the knocking, the whispering, the desperate pleas of something trapped just beyond reach. And even though I'm miles away from that basement apartment, the memory haunts me, a chilling reminder of what happens when you listen to the sounds that shouldn't exist. The farmhouse sat perched on a lonely hill, surrounded by miles of dense forest. With its peeling paint and creaking floorboards, it was the kind of place that begged to be left alone. But the price had been too good to pass up, so despite its eerie aura, I signed the papers and moved in. It was meant to be my escape from the city, a quiet retreat where I could finally finish the novel I had been working on for years. At first, everything seemed perfect. The farmhouse was quaint and peaceful, filled with the scent of old wood and earth. I spent my days writing and my evenings walking along the forest trails, embracing the solitude. But as the days turned into weeks, I began to notice things that made my skin crawl. It started with small noises, a soft tapping on the walls, faint footsteps in the empty hallways. I tried to brush it off, blaming it on the creaky old house and my overactive imagination. But then, I began seeing shadows moving in the corners of my vision, disappearing whenever I turned to look. One night, as I sat at my desk working, I heard a strange rustling noise coming from outside. It was faint but steady, like someone, or something, pacing back and forth beneath my window. I tried to ignore it, but the noise grew louder, more insistent, until I finally mustered the courage to look outside. What I saw sent a chill down my spine. In the dim light of the moon, I could make out a figure standing just beyond the tree line, staring up at the house. It was too far away to make out any features, but I could feel its gaze fixed on me, cold and unblinking. I closed the curtains, heart pounding, and tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The figure returned every night, always standing in the same spot, always watching. I tried to ignore it, but its presence seeped into my dreams, turning them into twisted nightmares filled with shadows and whispers. One night, the figure appeared closer, standing just a few yards from the house. I could see it more clearly now, a tall, gaunt figure with hollow eyes and pale skin, watching me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I wanted to run, to pack my bags and leave, but something held me in place, a morbid curiosity that kept me rooted to the spot. The next morning, I found strange markings on the walls, faint but unmistakable, a series of symbols scratched into the wood, symbols I didn't recognize but felt an inexplicable dread looking at. They were scattered throughout the house, hidden in corners and behind furniture, as if someone, or something, had been trying to leave a message. I tried to find answers, searching through old records and newspapers, but there was nothing about the house or the hill it sat on. The locals were tight-lipped, avoiding my questions with worried glances and hurried excuses. It was as if the farmhouse was a place people preferred not to think about, a forgotten relic best left undisturbed. That night, the figure appeared again, closer than ever, standing right outside my window. I could see its face now, a twisted mask of anger and sorrow, its eyes filled with a hunger that sent a wave of terror through me. I backed away, tripping over my chair, my mind racing as the figure's gaze followed me. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but I knew no one would come. I was alone, trapped in this old farmhouse with whatever haunted the shadows outside. I locked myself in my bedroom, barricading the door and praying for dawn. But as the hours dragged on, the shadows grew thicker, filling the room with a suffocating darkness. I could hear the figure outside, scratching at the walls, whispering words I couldn't understand but felt deep in my bones. Just before dawn, the scratching stopped, and the silence that followed was almost worse. I waited, holding my breath, until the first light of morning crept through the window. When I finally dared to open the door, the house was empty, but the symbols on the walls were deeper now, freshly carved and glistening with something dark and wet. I packed my bags and left that same morning, abandoning my dreams of a peaceful retreat. The farmhouse stands empty now, a silent sentinel on the lonely hill, waiting for the next soul to dare enter its shadows. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see the figure standing outside my window, its hollow eyes watching, waiting. And I know that no matter how far I run, I will never truly escape the shadows on the hill. The Crossroads Diner was a staple of the town, a tiny, neon-lit building in the middle of nowhere, just off the old highway. People came and went throughout the day, but I only worked the graveyard shift. I needed the cash, and the owner offered an extra $1 an hour to brave the midnight, dawn shift alone. At first, I thought the diner was just a quiet, lonely place at night. The few regulars who came in knew each other, sharing coffee and pie as they unwound from late night drives or truck routes. The stories they told about eerie encounters on empty highways or strange sightings in the nearby woods added a chill to the otherwise calm evenings. I always took them with a grain of salt, until one night. It was a night when no one came. Midnight passed, then one, and by two, I hadn't seen a single car or heard the familiar hum of an engine. The diner felt still, the silence so thick it was almost oppressive. I tried to keep myself busy, wiping down the counters, refilling the ketchup bottles, but a strange feeling prickled at the back of my mind, an instinct that something wasn't right. Around 3, I finally heard the chime of the diner's door. I looked up, expecting to see one of the usuals. Instead, a man stood in the doorway, drenched from head to toe as if he'd been walking through a storm, though the night outside had been clear. His clothes were dark and tattered, his face pale, eyes hollow, but there was something else about him, a sense of dread that seemed to follow him, filling the air with a suffocating weight. "Just coffee, please," he muttered, sliding into a booth at the far end of the diner. His voice was low and rough, each word like a shiver of static. I nodded, grabbing the coffee pot, trying to keep my hands steady as I walked over to his table. When I poured, the coffee was as thick as tar, blacker than usual, and steam rose from it in odd, twisting patterns. He watched me the entire time, his gaze unblinking, as if he could see straight through me. When I turned to walk back to the counter, I felt a cold chill run down my spine. In the stainless steel reflection of the coffee machine, I could see him watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I forced myself to look away, hoping he wouldn't notice my discomfort. Minutes ticked by, and the man just sat there, not drinking his coffee, just staring at it, almost as if he was waiting for something. I busied myself with small tasks, pretending I didn't notice him, but the silence pressed down on me, making it impossible to ignore. Then, just when I thought the night couldn't get stranger, the door chimed again. Another figure entered, similar to the first, soaked, pale, with an unsettling presence that made the air feel thicker. This one took a seat opposite the first man without a word, and they both sat in silence, facing each other with a tense and readable expression. I could feel their presence like a weight, and the diner, once familiar and comforting, felt foreign, as if it had been transported somewhere else entirely. The air grew colder, and the lights dimmed slightly, flickering in a way that set my nerves on edge. As I watched, more figures entered, one by one, each taking a seat in silence, each just as drenched and eerie as the last. By 4, every booth was filled, the diner packed with these ghostly figures, all staring at each other in a silent, unsettling communion. None of them touched their coffee or acknowledged me. They just sat, filling the air with an unearthly stillness. I wanted to leave, to run, but something held me in place, an invisible force that rooted me to the spot. It was as if the diner itself had become a trap, holding me and these spectral visitors in its grip. Then, the clock struck 4:30, and in unison, they all turned to look at me. Their eyes were dark and hollow, filled with something ancient and otherworldly. I felt a shiver run through me, a primal terror that told me I was in the presence of something far beyond my understanding. One of them stood, a woman with long, wet hair that clung to her face. She walked up to the counter, her footsteps silent, and placed a coin in my hand, a small old-fashioned coin with an unfamiliar symbol engraved. "You've been chosen," she whispered, her voice soft but carrying an unshakable weight. "We'll see you next time." And just like that, they all stood, walking out of the diner one by one, leaving only silence and the lingering chill of their presence behind. When I looked down, The coin had vanished, leaving only a faint imprint in my palm. The diner was empty again, as if they had never been there. But I knew they would return, that they would come for me when the time was right. To this day, I still work the graveyard shift, waiting for that midnight hour when the chime of the door will signal their return. And every night, I wonder if this will be the night they come back for me, to take me into whatever dark place they call home,